you could please take your seats. We're going to get started with our keynote address. Okay, so we are honored to have such an illustrious speaker who's come from such a long distance to be with us. And also, I just want to say some words about the role of the person who will be introducing her, Mishuana Goeman, who is our colleague here at UCLA and who has done really an amazing job as part of the planning committee, not only to make the address possible, but the entire event. I want to thank her publicly and hand her the floor.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I always get a little embarrassed by this sort of public thank you, so I'm a little red in the face. This crowd is going to shush throughout the presentation. All right, I knew he was going to throw me off my game. So, I'd like to really begin this evening, actually, with thanking the Tomva people whose land we're on. It's always important to recognize place and people's place and the original settlement of the people here. It's too often forgotten in California, as my son's recent mission project reminds me. So I'd also like to thank Aileen for coming for such a long distance. I'd like to thank CRS. I'd like to thank Saul, especially, who's been running this event spectacularly. And yes, he has found those of us out there extra drink tickets. And he also has been in charge of the food and all sorts of those things. And I'd especially like to thank Addie, whose vision this conference was. She's done a spectacular job as well. And what few of you may know, Addie gave birth, I think, only 2 weeks ago. So in the midst of planning a conference, Addie has been spectacular at, bringing the baby to the meetings. And she's just like, she's my kind of girl. So she's been relentless at just really making this conference happen and working out all the details. I know we have one more day, so there's many more details to work out, but her and Saul are working together as a tag team. It's great. And I'd like to thank Cheryl, who really listens and is just like a wonderful person, generous of spirit, generous of heart. And so I'd really like to thank Cheryl Harris as well. And I'd also really like to thank Angela Riley, whose presence, her recent presence at the same time, there were many of us who came in at the same time, and her direction in the American Indian Studies program has just been amazing. And she has provided a lot of connections all around campus, and she's always also willing to listen. And I think in terms of the interdisciplinarity that you see at this conference, that's such an important trait. And I know, American Indian Studies, a lot of people tend to get a little worried because it's like, oh no, the lawyers are going to dominate, right? But I think like between Cheryl and Addie and Saul, their ability to really listen to other disciplines and think about what other disciplines are saying has made this quite successful. And Angela's has her ability to just reach out across and talk to people and communicate across disciplines at UCLA is making this an exciting and growing place. And I'd really like to thank Angela Riley for that. And just a side mention, I'd like to thank Kelly, who is Eileen's, he's all the way in Australia, but I'd like to thank him too, Kelly Roberts, and we can all wish him good from afar. So he's been really wonderful. And I'd like to thank Rusty, because Rusty is the logistics man, and that's not fun for anybody, right? So I'd like to thank Rusty as well. All right, so with that, let's get to Aileen. I first met Aileen several years ago now, and it was quite the first meeting. And anybody who meets Aileen tends to remember when they've met Aileen Moreton-Robinson. She has just the presence of mind. She tells it like it is, and her talks are always wonderful. So when we were talking about this particular conference and what we wanted to discuss, many of us in the room automatically thought of Aileen. And it was pretty unanimous. I expected there to be some argument, right, because it is a law conference and arguments. But everybody was pretty on board with Aileen because of her work. Aileen, I always have problems with vowels when I'm nervous, which hopefully I get the time. So when I first met her, we just hit it off from the start, but that bluntness and that just telling it like it is and her intellectual vigor when she approaches things is so important. And when discussion issues of sovereignty or human rights, etc., I tend to think of Cherie Moraga's words when she talks about foregoing our polite timidities, right? And that it's our polite timidities that are killing us, especially across lines of differences. And so when I think of the work of some of the feminists that I love, particularly, such as Audre Lorde or Cherie Moraga or these women who make a difference, part of the reasons that we get anywhere around these difficult dialogues and difficult subjects, which I believe after organizing this conference, which has been incredibly pleasurable to me, is that the heart of CRS is about that critical race studies, and having heard Cheryl talk about that, and also Saul and others, that's what makes a difference in the end, is getting those difficult dialogues and addressing the issues that we often don't want to discuss. And I feel like this issue that stems from Addie's research is part of that difficult dialogues, is part of not letting the polite timidities kill us. And that's a hard task in a collegiate environment where collegiality or not discussing controversial things does tend to be the death of us in the academy. And so Aileen, who works with whiteness and possession as her mini Aileen, so sorry, Aileen, Aileen, as she talks to us through her writings and just in her presence and being within the academy, has been so important. She's a professor of Indigenous Studies, I'll get to the nitty-gritty, and the director of the Indigenous Studies Research Network at Queensland University. Before this path, this morning I opened it up and I was going to write the nitty-gritty parts of this introduction, and I got a 24-page CV. And let me tell you, it wasn't padded. It was just, she's been that important in the world, globally, locally, and at every multiscalar level. Before her job in the Academy, she was the acting state manager of the Queensland State Office, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, Director of Research, Foundation for Aboriginal and Islander Research Action Corporation, and the list goes on and long for another couple pages. So those are just the most recent of the past history. But once at the university, she also began to be unrelentless in pursuing and creating a space for Aboriginal scholars throughout the university. Through her teaching and the myriad of research positions and directorships that she's held directorships in gender studies, feminist studies, citizenship and human rights studies, and throughout all of this, she has procured many a grant. Let me tell you, that was also another 2 pages, her CV, just her grant procurement, in order to fund students and create connections between Indigenous peoples. And this is on an international scale, which I think is why in this discussion of race and sovereignty, Aileen's work becomes so important. As I have seen throughout, I know at least personally in my own work and thinking about place and indigeneity and cultural geographies and such, she's been incredibly encouraging, but more than that, she's been incredibly rigorous with me, getting me out of my U.S. and Canadian-centric. I always thought, if I had Canada only, so I was a little bit excused. But really out of that North American, and when I say North American, I do mean Canada and the U.S., that mentality and really bringing to light what Australian Aboriginal people are doing. And she has been at the forefront of creating those networks between Indigenous people and the United States and Australia. And that's why her work is so important. She's published 4 books now. In 2008, she had the Transnational Whiteness Matters. Also, Sovereign Subjects, Indigenous Sovereignty Matters, which is incredible to teach. My students love it. And The Whitening Race, Essays in Social and Cultural Criticism in Australia. And then another one I teach quite often that I love in my Women's Studies course because it makes us rethink gender and feminism completely, is Talking Up to the White Woman, Indigenous Women and Feminism. So these are great texts, and if you haven't read them, I highly suggest it. Now, I can't go through all the chapters in her books because there are, I don't know. I'm estimating. I'm an English major, English PhD holder. There must be like 40 chapters and books here. She has quite the CV. But I did highlight some that I think are particularly relevant to this matter. Particularly her most recent, White Possession and the Legacy of Cook's Choice, an Imagined Australia, and reflections around the reciprocal construction of identity between Australia and Europe. We also see Indigenous methodologies and social research, writing off treaties, white possession in the United States, critical whiteness studies literature and transnational whiteness matters, and epistemic violence, the hidden injuries of whiteness in Australia, gendering and racializing self-determination, Indigenous women and patriarchal whiteness. So you get the sense. Too often, when we think about race and sovereignty, we may be thinking about the issue with the freedmen between black and Indian relationships, or between Indian and Chicana relationships, perhaps. But one of the reasons a lot of us felt this was important is not to deny whiteness as a racial construct as well, and that Aileen really brings that to the forefront of why a conference like this is important. And I'm so very happy that she's here to speak to this and enlighten us all. She will be having a piece forthcoming, too, in the special edition of American Indian and Cultures Research Journal, where she does a more cultural studies type approach to whiteness on the beach, white bodies on the beach in Australia. So it's also very sexy. So be sure to check that out. It will be coming out in the fall. It's the way she writes is very sexy, and the way she speaks is very sexy. So with that, I'll introduce her paper. I always tell my graduate students that's what matters than giving a paper. So her paper is entitled Dissenting States, Possessive Logic of Patriarchal White Sovereignty and the United States Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So please welcome Quandamoka First Nations, I was not supposed to say Queen, but Aileen Moreton-Robinson. Thank you.
To do that. This is really a moment for me. I truly am humbled by being asked to speak in this program, mainly because it's such an amazing program, the Critical Race program, and I just think that your global reach is profound, and I know that it was like particularly Professor Cheryl Harris's work was like a light going on in the dark, and I really am honoured and absolutely shitting myself. So I want to begin by, let's hold it together, Aileen. I want to begin by acknowledging the sovereignty of the Tomva people, and I want to thank Rudy and Mark for their prayers. I really want to, I don't know whether I want to thank Mishuana and Cheryl for inviting me, but I do. I'm very, very, very honoured. There are far more worthy candidates, I can tell you. I'd like to also thank Professor Angela Riley for sponsoring this, and if I apologise for my pronunciation as well. Sayul Sabria for the head of the Critical Race Studies program. I'd like to acknowledge the intellectual debt to my ancestors, and my intellectual debt to Professor Cheryl Harris, Professor David Theo Goldberg, and Dr. Fiona Nicol from Australia. And of course, Michel Foucault. And the indigenous scholars that hold me, in particular, Audra Simpson, Chris Anderson, Brendan Hoka-Witu, and Mishuana Goeman. I'll draw on your strength for this paper, and I hope that I don't channel George W. Bush, but I probably will. So in considering the theme for this symposium on sovereignty and race, I've chosen to focus on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples because its existence provides an opportunity to explore how race and sovereignty are entangled. My intention is not to examine the contents of the Declaration or consider its legality. Instead, the focus of my paper is on Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the United States statements of dissent and subsequent endorsement of the Declaration. So now, after more than 2 decades of deliberations within various mechanisms of the United Nations, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was put before the General Assembly for its consideration on the 13th of September 2007. The political roots of this declaration lie with Haudenosaunee Chief Deskahe, and Maori T.W. Ratana, who respectively in 1923 and 1925 sought access to the League of Nations to bring to the attention of the international community Canada and New Zealand's violations of treaty agreements and rights. Now, both these men were denied access to the League of Nations Assembly after successful lobbying by Britain, Canada and New Zealand, who argued that the issues raised were domestic rather than international matters and should be treated accordingly. Chief Deskahe and T.W. Ratana, though unsuccessful in their advocacy, provided a pathway for the contemporary global Indigenous rights movement. Some 86 years later, Indigenous peoples continue to express the same concerns at the United Nations. Now, the United Nations is primarily a statist organisation, as is evidenced in Article 2 of its Charter, which consecrates the doctrine of equal sovereignty, territorial integrity and non-intervention. Australia, Canada and New Zealand and the United States are founding members and were instrumental in its development. Now, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was the outcome of the accumulated efforts of Indigenous non-government organisations, activists and transnational networks. In the 1970s, they began to develop an international Indigenous rights document to protect the rights of Indigenous people. Indigenous peoples from Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, Canada and the United States played key roles in the deliberations. They advocated for the Declaration to be a major objective of the UN International Decade of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which was between 1995 and 2004. However, its fruition did not occur until the UN's second decade of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which started in 2005 and ends in 2015. The delay in finalising the Declaration was due in large part to the opposition and debates generated by several states as it moved through UN processes. In particular, Canada, New Zealand, Australia and the United States were persistent objectors on the provisions relating to the right of self-determination, lands, territories and resources. The United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia were the only states to vote against the Declaration, which was endorsed by 144 member states, constituting the majority of the United Nations General Assembly. Almost half of the Indigenous population of the world lives within the borders of these 4 states. Ania and Wiesner argued that there were very few changes made to the draft declaration after its endorsement by the Human Rights Council and transition to the General Assembly. They note, and this is a rather extensive quote, "Beyond recognition of the right to self-determination, the Council's text formulated an array of tailor-made collective rights, such as the right to maintain and develop their distinct political, economic, social and cultural identities and characteristics, as well as their legal systems, and to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social and cultural life of the state. Indigenous peoples were guaranteed the right not to be subjected to genocide or ethnocide, i.e. action aimed at or affecting their integrity as distinct peoples, their cultural values and identities, including the dispossession of land, forced relocation, assimilation or integration, the imposition of foreign lifestyles and propaganda. The stated rights guaranteed include the right to observe, teach and practice tribal, spiritual and religious traditions, the right to maintain and protect manifestations of their cultures, archaeological historical sites and artefacts, the right to restitution of spiritual property taken without their free and informed consent, including the right to repatriate Indigenous human remains and the right to protection of sacred places, burial sites, the rights to maintain and use tribal languages, to transmit their oral histories and traditions, to education in their language and to control over their own educational systems, the right to maintain and develop their political, economic and social systems, and to determine and to develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. Those treaties with states should be recognised, observed and enforced. The Declaration supports the right of Indigenous people to own, develop, control and use the lands and territories which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used, including the right to restitution of lands confiscated, occupied or otherwise taken without their free and informed consent, with the option of providing just and fair compensation wherever such returns is not possible." End of quote. Now, since the adoption of the Declaration, several legal scholars have examined the history of its development and the scope of its influence on international law. Others have argued that the Declaration declares a set of rights and morally obligates all declaring states to implement and enforce those rights. It lays the foundation for the creation of future binding international law, expressed primarily through multilateral treaties based on the Declaration's principles, and secondarily through the development of customary international law. However, state violation of Indigenous rights is not judicially enforceable within international courts. Now, this literature responds implicitly or explicitly to two of the key assertions made by the states who voted against the Declaration. The first assertion is that the Declaration is a moral and political document, but not a legally binding one. And second, the internal laws of the state will prevail. Now, these assertions were made by dissenting states, even though Article 46.1 of the Declaration qualifies the Indigenous rights encapsulated within the document. It does so by precluding the right to take any action by state, people, group or person contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, or any that would dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. Article 46.2 states that the exercising of the rights enshrined in the document are limited by law and human rights obligations. The limitations imposed on Indigenous rights and the protection of state sovereignty by the Declaration raises a question. If, as Canada, New Zealand and the USA and Australia assert, the Declaration is a moral and political document that is not legally binding, what is operating discursively to affect their opposition and subsequent endorsement of it? This paper will argue the possessive logic of patriarchal white sovereignty operates discursively, deploying virtue as a strategic device to oppose and subsequently endorse the Declaration. As an attribute of patriarchal white sovereignty, virtue functions as a usable property to dispossess Indigenous peoples from the ground of moral value. This will be demonstrated through analysing the introduction and 4 key right areas that were contested by Canada, Australia and New Zealand, followed by core elements of their subsequent endorsement of the Declaration. However, I will first attend to defining my theoretical framework. Here we go. Now, my concept of patriarchal white sovereignty draws on the work of Foucault, who argued that sovereignty is born of war, enabled by a mythology of the divine right of kings. So sovereign absolutism was marked by gender and race in the 17th century, though race was considered as a linguistic marker at this time. Now, patriarchal white sovereign absolutism, though internally fractured, waged war to appropriate land and resources. Thus, the foundations of modern sovereignty have a gendered and racial ontology. That is, a sovereignty's divine being as a regime of power constituted by and through gender and race. The transition from sovereign absolutism to its modern form was produced through a counter-discourse of rights, through the challenge to the king's power by his knights. Foucault argues that having become legitimate and normalised, no nobility's assertion of rights was utilised by the commoners as an impetus to the French Revolution, and in this way a partisan and strategic truth became a weapon of war. So within modernity, sovereignty shifts from being concerned with society defending itself against external threats to its focus on its internal enemies. And race becomes the means through which the state's exercise of power is extended from one to let live or die to one to let live and to make live. For Foucault, race and sovereignty have a symbiotic relationship. Goldberg further develops this point when he argues sovereignty is the defining and refining condition of modern state formation, and the law is deeply embedded in intensifying and cementing lines of power in state formation. In discussing states of racial being, he argues that, and I quote, "It is important to recognise that the racial state trades on gender determinations, reproducing its racial configurations in gendered terms and its gendered forms racially. Bodies are governed colonially and post-colonially through their constitutive positioning as racially engendered and in the gendering of their racial configuration," end of quote. So Australia, Canada, the United States and New Zealand are racial states, whereby patriarchal white sovereignty as a regime of power is the defining and refining condition of their formations, ordaining them ontologically with a sense of divinity. When Foucault argued metaphorically that sovereignty in its modern form is represented as a headless king whose body is still intact, he is talking about the manifestation of sovereign power within the modern state. However, he leaves the trace metaphysical connection between the dismembered head and body as unexamined. Unlike Foucault, Derrida recognised this in his construction of sovereignty as a metaphysical category that encroaches on life insofar as it nominates a power, potency or capability that is found in the very I can. There is no liberty without selfhood and no selfhood without liberty. Derrida's notion of I can requires will as much as it requires freedom in his concept of popular sovereignty. However, there is a fundamental distinction between the sovereignty of the individual and the sovereignty of the state, though both require the prevention of intervention from outside. Now, Kant argues that this protection from the invention of others has its ontological roots in Christianity, and he argues, and I quote, "Historically it emerges directly from the wars of the Reformation and represents the same kind of prudential response to diversity within the Christian faiths that liberalism more generally represents. The prudential, however, rests on a deeper principle of Christian belief. The truth and the true virtue of the individual is located in the interior working of the will, in the way in which the subject brings himself into a relationship with God. Politically, this point supports the conception of truth of the state as a manifestation of interior self-realisation rather than outward power," end of quote. So in this way, sovereign power is a state's internal self-realisation of its truth and virtue, whereby will and possession operate discursively. So virtue functioned as a usable property within the legal doctrine of discovery, which provided the rationale for sovereign wills to take possession of indigenous peoples' lands from the 16th century onwards. This doctrine was developed in the 15th and 16th centuries by Spain, Portugal, England, France and the Church to enable the theft of indigenous peoples' lands. It was their divinely ordained destiny to redeem the lesser humans of the world through the application of their unique moral virtues. In this way, virtue functions within the ontology of possession, which occurs through the imposition of sovereign will to be on indigenous lands and peoples, which are perceived to lack will, thus they are open to being possessed. This enables sovereignty to lay claim to own indigenous lands and peoples because willful possession of what was previously a will-less thing is constitutive of its ontology. It is invoked whenever the state proclaims its ownership. The state's assertion that it owns the land becomes part of a normative behaviour, rules of interaction and social engagement embodied by its citizens. It is most acutely manifested in the form of the state and the judiciary. Thus, possession and virtue form part of the ontological structure of patriarchal white sovereignty, which is reinforced by its socio-discursive functioning within society, enabled by the body of the state. As part of state formation and regulation, patriarchal white sovereignty is mobilised through a possessive logic that operates ideologically and socio-discursively. Here I use the concept possessive logic to denote a mode of rationalisation rather than a set of positions that produce a more or less inevitable answer that is underpinned by an excessive desire to invest in reproducing and reaffirming the state's ownership, control and domination. The possessive logic of patriarchal white sovereignty is compelled to deny and refuse what it cannot own, the sovereignty of the indigenous other. This ontological disturbance or fracture is one of the reasons why the state deploys virtue when working hard at racial and gendered maintenance and domination in the guise of good government. Virtue functions through reason within sets of meanings about patriarchal white ownership of the nation within the law, as part of common sense knowledge, decision making and socially produced conventions by which societies live and govern behaviour. The possessive logic of patriarchal white sovereignty has served to define the attributes of personhood and property through the law. As Harris argues, the theft of indigenous lands was ratified by bestowing and acknowledging the property rights of whites in indigenous lands. Only white possession and occupation of land was validated and therefore privileged as a basis for property rights. The possessive logic of patriarchal white sovereignty was deployed in defining who was and who was not white, conferring privilege by identifying what legal entitlements accrued to those categorised as white. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the same logic was operative, making whiteness itself a visible form of property, particularly through immigration laws and those affecting indigenous peoples. And at the commencement of the 21st century, it continues to function invisibly, informing the legal exclusion and regulation of those who transgress within and outside its borders. For example, after the 9/11 attack on domestic soil, the US government increased domestic security measures through the law, which enabled the hyper-regulation and surveillance of citizens and visitors within its borders. It is no coincidence that Canada, Australia and New Zealand followed the US, implementing a similar domestic security regime. I will now turn to examine their collaborative efforts against the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. The endorsement of the Declaration by majority vote within the UN General Assembly produced an existential crisis for Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United States, who responded to this overwhelming support as if their sovereignty had been transgressed. They operationalised their possessive logic by mobilising virtue as a strategic vice to explain their dissent. Australia stated it, and I quote, has actively worked to ensure the adoption of a meaningful declaration. Canada noted it has been an active participant in its development, and New Zealand said it had worked hard to the very end to narrow our concerns and to be able to support this text, while the United States said we worked hard for 11 years in Geneva for a consensus declaration. Now, in deploying the notion of working hard as a virtue, these states are implicitly positioning the rest of the participants as not sharing their commitment and values, which is evidenced by their criticism of the process for the final drafting of the declaration. Australia said it had engaged constructively in the elaboration of the text, but was not given a chance to participate, this is a quote, in the negotiations on the current text of the declaration to achieve consensus. End of quote. Canada believed that, quote, had there been an appropriate process in place to address these concerns and the concerns of other states, a stronger declaration would have emerged. While the United States asserted, quote, the document before us is a text that was prepared and submitted after the negotiations had concluded. States were given no opportunity to discuss it collectively. It is disappointing that the Human Rights Council did not respond to calls we made in partnership with Council members for states to undertake further work to generate a consensus text, end of quote. These assertions of constructive participation in the development of the Declaration belied their consistent objections during the 20 years of its formation. In a discursive turn, they operationalise virtue by positioning themselves as willing and constructive participants, implying that Indigenous participants were destructive and unwilling. This is why the process was inappropriate and their concerns not addressed. The process is positioned as being flawed to the extent of the lack of prioritisation and inclusion of their concerns in the final text. Their assumed sovereign right to possess and control the process is asserted, notwithstanding their minority representation as dissenting states. And this is evidenced by the way they exaggerate the degree of support from other states in order to amplify their position. They appeal to reaching consensus on the document, which they assert would have been made stronger by their involvement, is a disingenuous strategy aimed at recuperating virtue to mask how they actively worked against any consensual outcome. In their opening remarks, Canada, New Zealand and the United States said that they hoped the document would promote harmonious relations between states and Indigenous peoples. Canada noted, and I quote, "We have sought for many years, along with others, an aspirational document that would advance Indigenous rights and promote harmonious arrangements between Indigenous peoples and the states in which they live." End of quote. New Zealand said, "In our experience, the promotion and protection of Indigenous rights requires a partnership between the state and Indigenous peoples that is constructive and harmonious." End of quote. While the United States stated, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, if it were to encourage harmonious and constructive relations, should have been written in terms that are transparent and capable of implementation. Australia did not mention that harmonious relations were an aspiration of the document, and all four states reiterated that they would continue to work to promote Indigenous rights nationally and internationally. By raising or ignoring the concern that the Declaration should have promoted harmonious relations between Indigenous peoples and states, these states are implicitly blaming it for promoting the disharmony. By bringing the need for harmony to the surface, they are unconsciously acting out that which is repressed, their disharmonious relations with Indigenous people. If harmony existed between Indigenous peoples and states, then there would be no need to raise it as an issue to be promoted. They discursively deploy virtue through reiteratively stating that they are working to protect Indigenous rights, while displacing the cause of their respective internal Indigenous state conflict onto the document and by default Indigenous peoples. They take possession of the moral high ground by blaming Indigenous peoples for not wanting to work in harmony, a strategy deployed in their opposition to core provisions of the Declaration. In particular, the nature of the Declaration was a core shared concern. Australia stated that, quote, "It is the clear intention of all states that it be an aspirational document with political and moral force, but not legal force. It is not intended itself to be legally binding or reflective of international law," end of quote. Canada noted that, start quote, "For clarity, we also underlie our understanding that this declaration is not a legally binding instrument. It has no legal effect in Canada, and its provisions do not represent customary international law." In contrast, New Zealand stated that while the declaration is explained as being aspirational and, quote, "intended to inspire rather than to have legal effect, it is unable to support a text that includes provisions that are so fundamentally incompatible with our democratic processes, our legislation and our constitutional arrangements," end of quote. The United States said, "It was the clear intention of all states that it be an aspirational declaration with political and moral rather than legal force. The United States rejects any possibility that this document is or can become customary international law." Now, if the states stipulate Indigenous rights are only aspirational, something desired to achieve, then why invoke the law, domestic or international, to refuse any legality? In doing so, they are staking a possessive claim to international law by defining its limits. They reduce the context of the Declaration to mere aspiration, albeit with moral and political force, to argue against the legality of Indigenous rights. In doing so, they reveal a displaced desire to render the Declaration legally void in order to refuse Indigenous rights claims. They recuperate virtue by negation. Indigenous rights should have no legal status within international law because states are the primary subjects of international law and possess the greatest range of rights and obligations. It is interesting that these 4 states express no real concern about the moral and political force of the Declaration. This is because as members of the United Nations, their sovereign independence is guaranteed. It is their sovereign right to subject Indigenous peoples to their law, morality and politics without intervention. Now, one of the core rights within the Declaration, the right to self-determination, was opposed by Australia and the USA. Australia argued that the right of self-determination only applied to, quote, situations of decolonisation and the breakup of states into smaller states within clearly defined population groups. It is not a right that attaches to an undefined subgroup of a population seeking to obtain political independence, end of quote. The Australian state, by referring to Indigenous peoples as an undefined subgroup of a population, is clearly signifying what our status should be. The USA stipulated that the right to self-determination, which was extracted from Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, is ambiguous. However, it does not confer a right for Indigenous peoples to be independent or self-governing within nations, nor does it confer permanent sovereignty over resources. The US argued that this was the clear intent of states during consultations, whereas the Declaration implies a right that does not exist. The US appears not to have a problem with the ambiguity of self-determination as defined within the respective covenants which it endorsed. But the right to self-determination within the Declaration of its Indigenous rights is a problem. Both Australia and the United States argue that the Indigenous right to self-determination is a false rights claim and one that was not supported by other states. This is a spurious assertion given that the majority of states voted for the Declaration. Invoking state homogeneity within the UN on this provision is a way of positioning the document as being falsely representative of state views. Self-determination has been primarily a right of states and is inextricably tied to exercising sovereignty. So to deny this right to Indigenous peoples is a way of refusing and disavowing Indigenous sovereignty, which is consistent and all too evident in their respective treatment of Indigenous peoples. For example, the unresolved issues first brought to the League of Nations by Discursive continue today between the Six Nations, Haudenosaunee and the Canadian federal government. Virtue operates discursively to question the legitimacy of this provision within the Declaration by Australia and the US, reiterating a possessive claim to the integrity of their sovereignty against Indigenous counterclaims. Their possessiveness was also exhibited in their response to the provisions on land and resources contained within the Declaration. Australia asserted that they, quote, could be read to require recognition of Indigenous rights to lands without regard to other existing legal rights pertaining to land, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Any right to traditional lands must be subject to national laws. Canada said that it had processes in place to deal with lands, territories and resources through its treaty mechanisms and constitution. It argued that the broad and unclear provisions could be susceptible to a number of interpretations, quote, discounting the need to recognise a range of rights over land, possibly putting into question matters that have already been settled by treaty in Canada. End of quote. New Zealand stated the provisions on lands and resources simply cannot be implemented. Article 26 appears to require recognition of rights to lands now fully owned by other citizens, and the entire country is potentially caught within the scope of the article. The United States asserted that, quote, the provision on lands and resources are phrased in a manner that is particularly unworkable, the language is overly broad and inconsistent, Article 26 appears to require recognition of Indigenous rights to lands without regard to other legal rights existing in these lands. Now, these states disavowed the collective rights of Indigenous peoples by positioning themselves as virtuous states that govern in the interests of other legal rights in land. The discursive twist in the use of other legal rights to implicitly appeal to diversity is an attempt to deflect attention away from the protection of their sovereign rights. In effect, they are proclaiming that land already owned and occupied under state sovereignty will not be diminished or changed by indigenous proprietary rights. With missionary zeal, these states have already determined what is best for their indigenous peoples by defining what indigenous rights are acceptable. In this way, they stake a possessive claim to us. The right to determine what constitutes indigenous rights was also manifest in these states' opposition to the article on prior, free and informed consent. Australia argued that, I quote, any right to free, prior and informed consent goes too far. It would mean that states are obligated to consult with indigenous peoples about every aspect of law that might affect them. That would not only be unworkable, it applies a standard that others do not have. Canada stated that this was unduly restrictive and that it had consultation processes in place supported by the law. It asserted that, I quote, a complete veto power of legislative and administrative action for a particular group would be fundamentally incompatible with Canada's parliamentary system. New Zealand argued that it welcomed Maori involvement in its democratic process, but that, quote, these articles in the Declaration text imply different classes of citizenship, where Indigenous peoples have a right of veto that other groups or individuals do not have. New Zealand cannot endorse a document that does not reflect state practice or can be recognised as general principles of law. The United States stated it supported Indigenous peoples' involvement in government decision-making, quote, but it could not accept the notion of a subnational group having a veto power over the legislative process. The assertion that Article 19 confers a right which other citizens do not have is disingenuous to the extent that it is qualified by Article 46 within the Declaration. These four states rationalise their opposition on the grounds that all citizens should have the same rights and prior, free and informed consent is unworkable. They make a possessive claim that there is no space to negotiate the law's application. Yet they have created a distinct legal position for Indigenous peoples who reside within their borders, one that is not shared by other citizens. The originary lack of prior, free and informed consent by states created a status of indigeneity, and the matters pertaining to it are already prepossessed. States regulate and discipline Indigenous peoples on the basis of our different status and rights claims in ways that do not threaten their sovereignty. In negating a qualified Indigenous right to prior, free and informed consent, these states turn equal rights for all citizens into a virtue of their own making as they govern for the good of all. In spite of these strenuous objections, Australia endorsed the Declaration on the 3rd of April 2009, followed by New Zealand on the 19th of April 2010, Canada on the 12th of November 2010, and the United States on the 16th of December 2010. Now, in their statements of endorsement, these four states made a discursive shift from indignation to reconciliation. They mobilised a virtue to stake a possessive claim to the Declaration while affirming patriarchal white sovereignty. All four states acknowledged that there were injustices committed in the past. Canada and the US referred to their formal apologies as evidence that they were sincere and now they're transcending their histories. Australia stated that the Declaration offered a new era of relations between states and Indigenous peoples grounded in good faith, goodwill and mutual respect. The government would not forcibly remove Indigenous peoples from their lands or territories, and nor will their culture be destroyed. There will be no repetition of past policies. Canada said the Declaration was important to Indigenous peoples throughout the world. Endorsing the Declaration will reconcile and enable stronger relations between the Canadian state and Aboriginal peoples. Canada stated it has a productive and active partnership with Aboriginal peoples and has advanced Indigenous rights domestically and abroad. The principles of the Declaration are consistent with the government's approach to working with Indigenous peoples. while New Zealand noted that the principles of the Declaration, quote, are consistent with the duties and principles inherent in the treaty, such as operating in the spirit of partnership and mutual respect, end of quote. The US's announcement of its pending endorsement, which was made by President Obama to the Tribal Council's conference, and he stated that the promises he made, well, on the campaign trail in 2007 would be kept. This included Native Americans having a voice at the White House, the appointment of Native American advisors, and convening the largest Native American conference to discuss the relationship between the government and Native Americans are evidence of his commitment. The endorsement of these 4 states functions as both confession and absolution. They have atoned for the past by apologising and recognising that injustices occurred. They are moving towards a more just future based on a new relationship of working together to bring about change. Their virtue is now recuperated through faith and hope. All 4 states outlined either directly or indirectly how they have acted to implement rights contained within the Declaration. Australia advised that it had returned large tracts of land and is committed to improving the social, cultural and economic aims of Indigenous people through an Indigenous Land Fund. Hallelujah. Australia acknowledged that Indigenous peoples do have the right to be free from discrimination and prejudice, and they will reinstate the Racial Discrimination Act, which had been suspended to allow the government to intervene into Indigenous communities. It is further noted that vulnerable Indigenous people have the right to be free from violence and to lead safe and healthy lives, so policies are in place to achieve this change. Australia stated that education is the key to economic and social prosperity, and respect for Indigenous culture is part of this process. The issue of free, prior and informed consent will, however, be interpreted by government in accordance with Article 46 of the Declaration. Australia will ensure that Indigenous involvement in the democratic process is enabled by the establishment of a national Indigenous representative body, public consultation on key policy decisions, support for Indigenous leadership and constitutional recognition of Indigenous people. Canada argued it is a leader in protecting Indigenous people's rights, and this is demonstrated by its initiatives in amending the Canadian Human Rights Act and changing the Indian Registration Act to enable gender equity concerning the matrimonial transfer of property. Canada noted that its endorsement of the Declaration adds scaffolding to the government's existing initiatives in the area of, quote, education, economic development, housing, child and family services, access to safe drinking water, and the extension of human rights protection and the matrimonial will property protection to First Nations on reserve, end of quote. New Zealand advised that it had transferred land and resources back to Māori, and redress had been offered, constrained, of course, by monetary circumstances. The principles for involvement, it said in decision-making that are contained in the Declaration, will be accommodated within the existing frameworks for Māori participation, of which consent is a part. Recognition is given to Māori worldviews and the cultural heritage, which should be reflected in laws and policies. New Zealand will continue to work for Indigenous people's human rights, while understanding that there will be debate and dialogue about meanings that may be given to the aspirations put forward by the Declaration. The US outlined how the government was working with Native American tribes to improve conditions on their lands. The US has committed funds for internet and physical infrastructure to improve economic growth on reservations, renovation of schools, increasing the size of tribal lands, improving healthcare, improving culturally relevant programs at tribal colleges. President Obama has signed the Tribal Law and Order Act to enable the reduction of substance abuse and crime, settle disputes between Native American farmers and the Department of Agriculture, and provided funds to settle outstanding lawsuits over water rights. So virtue circulates discursively through these good intentions. As benevolent states, they are working hard and consistently to improve the life chances of Indigenous people who live within their borders. They want to do the right thing to bring about change in accordance with the principles of the Declaration. They are contributing to the fulfilment of these rights and thereby the good life for Indigenous peoples. These states operationalise virtue through reconciliation. They assume that by acknowledging conflict occurred, harmony is miraculously restored between themselves and Indigenous peoples. In this way, they render us as being conveniently submissive to their sovereign will. Despite the reconciliatory tone of their statements and endorsement, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United States repeated their core objection to the declaration in their endorsement of it. Australia reaffirmed its position that the document is not legally binding and does not affect Australian law, but recognises that the principles of the declaration are already mirrored in international human rights to which it is committed. The declaration cannot be used in any way to impair Australia's territorial integrity or political unity, and current native title and land rights laws are not altered by supporting the declaration. Canada asserted that the document is aspirational, not legally binding, does not change Canadian law, and is not reflective of international law, but its endorsement is a significant step forward in strengthening relations with Aboriginal peoples. Canada feels it can now, quote, interpret the principles expressed in the declaration in a manner that is consistent with its constitutional and legal framework, though the concerns raised in 2007 remain. These rights are enshrined in our Constitution, in Canada saying these rights are enshrined in the Constitution, including their Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and are complemented by practical policies that adapt to their evolving reality. And they stated this framework will continue to be the cornerstone of our efforts to promote and protect the rights of Aboriginal Canadians. New Zealand concluded that it has strong commitment to human rights and Indigenous rights in particular. The latter are enshrined in the Treaty of Waitangi. In supporting the rights in the Declaration, the existing legal and constitutional arrangements remain, though they will evolve. They are the foundations that determine the boundaries of any engagement. These existing legal and constitutional arrangements will be maintained. The United States declared the Declaration is not legally binding or a statement of current international law, but it has moral and political force. Quote, it expresses the aspirations of the United States, aspirations that this country seeks to achieve within the structure of the US Constitution, laws and international obligations, while also seeking, where appropriate, to improve our laws and policies. The US believes that the concept of self-determination is not the same as in international law, and it views it as being consistent with its recognition of federally tribes to be self-governing, and it will act to extend this to native Hawaiians. The US argued that the Declaration did not change or define the concept of self-determination under existing international law, stating that Article 46 does not imply any right to take action that would dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. The US qualified its acceptance of the right to prior free and informed consent by noting that while it will consult, it does not necessarily require the consent of tribal leaders to act. The message is clear from all 4 states. Indigenous rights shall be reconciled to their sovereignty. It is their divine right to demarcate the limits of what they are willing to do. In conclusion, the Declaration qualifications on Indigenous rights provides fertile ground for the application of exclusionary practices by states who discriminate in favour of themselves, ensuring they protect and maintain their sovereign interests by the continuing denial and exclusion of Indigenous sovereignty. Patriarchal white sovereignty determines what constitutes Indigenous people's rights and what they will be subjected to in accordance with its authority and law. These subjections are always exclusionary for Indigenous peoples because the divine right of patriarchal white sovereignty prevails, and the definition and circumscription of rights become methods by which subjugation is carried out. I have shown how the possessive logic of patriarchal sovereignty deployed virtue as a strategic weapon to dispossess Indigenous people from the moral high ground. The Declaration ontologically disturbed patriarchal white sovereignty, which retaliated through political, legal and moral force to disavow the virtue of Indigenous rights. The Declaration was treated as an outside intervention that required the containment of the enemy within its borders. Indigenous peoples whose existence threatens the self-realisation of patriarchal white sovereignty's interior truth. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US consider themselves to be enlightened, tolerant and virtuous states. They want the United Nations to recognise that deep in their hearts they have compassion for Indigenous peoples and are sorry about their past injustices. They want the world to think highly of them, to admire their humanity, their sense of international responsibility and their acceptance of all races and religions. This is how the possessive logic of patriarchal white sovereignty operationalises its divine right, moral vanity and elevation in the service of its racism. Thank you.
I just wanted to let you all know the last shuttle leaves at 9 o'clock, but right now we're going to have some discussion for a couple minutes, and so then we'll... Okay. So let's open the floor for discussion. Somebody must have a question. Rifkin, you're letting me down here.
It's okay, you can be let down. You can let us down.
We'll start.
Because no one else is speaking, I'll offer a reflection. I'm Australian dual citizenship. I have this dual citizenship. And when the big question was there about, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for your talk. And with your final remarks, my instant reply was, yes, but they don't do that exactly so well. The patriarchal dynamics. But there was at ANU, at Australian National University, in the doctoral program on environment and indigenous dynamics, there was a cartoon that I came across. It was Bush and Howard hugging in towels, and it was at that time when there was the big question of whether he would say I'm sorry to the Aborigines and all of that was going on. So I just want to say with Obama and Rudd and beyond Rudd, at least we hope we're getting a little bit further along. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Patrick?
Aileen, can I just endorse that thanks, and I'm very proud of you. But with respect to the last questioner, it seems to me that empty gestures like Rudd's apology and so on, as it turned out to be, actually morally privilege the settler state all the more unassailably than otherwise. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Oh, look, absolutely. I think what I suppose kind of like what I wanted to bring in the paper, I don't know if it made much sense, but was the fact that we need to open up, we need to think about sovereignty ontologically and metaphysically as a regime power. Like we need to, I think that, and this is what Foucault wants us to do. Like in effect, he's saying let's move this stuff. And it just seems to me that, you know, we have to think about the ways in which those kind of vacuous statements really reinforce patriarchal white sovereignty, right? Which is kind of like what I was trying to say. And that, you know, they use virtue so well, you know, so well in their rationalizations in terms of what they do to all of us. And I think that, you know, and it works so well when people actually believe it, you know, like we're actually moving forward, you know, and and I guess that depends on where you're sitting on that line, whether, you know, like I can honestly say that, you know, some of the things that I think I see as happening for Indigenous people globally, particularly, you know, the Declaration, you know, it was played up as such a thing, and I just kept hearing Foucault echo in my head about the fact, the way in which rights actually are a form of subjugation, you know, and so that the only way, and it really made me start to think about belief. You know, it's about belief. It's kind of like, you know, we believe in sovereignty. Like, what is it like to imagine no sovereignty of the state? Like, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean to imagine that? Can we imagine no sovereignty? Can we? Like, or are we stuck? You know, can we imagine no sovereignty? And I would argue we can actually. I mean, okay, 2 steps back, maybe to get to 1 step forward. One of the reasons why, for me, the law in Australia can't recognise Indigenous sovereignty is because it is beyond its ontological and epistemological framework, right? It cannot see anything but itself. And so it tries to make, it's why rights is a way of making us and bringing us in to their idea of sovereignty. When in actual fact, you know, in terms of my people, sovereignty is not about rights, you know. It's about relationality, connectedness to ancestor, to creators. It's about responsibilities. It's about obligations. And I just think that, you know, the discourse of rights basically has seduced a lot of us into believing that it's something that it's not. Because fundamentally, you can have all the rights in the world, but if you don't have the resources to exercise them, they're pretty empty. You know, we've all got the right to work. Yo! You know, but whether we can actually afford, you know, to print out our CVs and, you know, have money to buy clothes to go for an interview and all those things, you know, that's having the right to work is precluded by that stuff. And so I just think that I'd like us to start to imagine sovereignty more in terms of kind of like where it came from, like that genealogy, because it affects all of us. And I noted some of the discussion in the earlier panels, and I was thinking, you know, like, it's not about Indigenous things versus black things. It's not about this stuff. It's about understanding what this thing is that we're all up against. We are all up against it. But we also need to understand that Indigenous sovereignty is actually central, as far as I'm concerned, to a framework to looking at the states. Because you can bet your bottom dollar the way in which they fucked us over is the way in which they fuck over other citizens. We basically have always been their experiment. If they want to do anything, they do it to us first. And then they filter it out. You know, they filter it out. I would even argue that slavery, right, you know, is inextricably tied to dispossession in ways in which we have yet to theorise about. And I think I'll just shut up now. And I'm sorry I swore.
The buses are leaving continually, so just to let you know. But Rifkin came up with a question, so I'll let him redeem himself. Here we go, 4 parts.
I'm waiting for my wine and my dinner.
One thing that I found striking was that all of the Anglophone settler states that refused to initially endorse the Declaration all said it has moral force. Right? It has moral and political force, which seems it's striking given the history of Indian law, given that the courts have consistently ruled matters of Indian law are political issues and therefore fall under the plenary power doctrine and are not actually constitutional rights issues. But in light of what you were arguing, what does it mean to say the Declaration has moral force but not legal force? What is it that then actually grounds the law? Is it virtue then? Or what is the grounding there if it's neither the moral nor the political?
See, I think that their claim that it has moral and political force is in terms of themselves. Like, I don't actually think that that's actually a reflection of the fact that it does have it. It's about, to me, the way in which they are asserting that they have moral and political force to disavow
sovereignty, to basically disavow the legal claims, to say, we have the right. We have the right to limit what your rights will be, and that's it. We're always up against the state's sovereignty, right? And it does define the limits, and it does so through very virtuous ways, like the notion of equality. We're all equal. And so, just for me, kind of like, I still need to think more through this. Look, I sort of have to apologise for being a bit teary, but I've had 3 deaths of elders. 3 elders have died before my trip here, and and this is kind of like written in that, so it seemed a little crazy. That's probably why. But I would argue it is a thing about they deploy virtue to dispossess us from the ground of moral value, which is actually Fiona Nichols' brilliant. Where are you, Fee?
Oh, the photographer.
Oh, sorry. I'd recommend everybody go to this paper. But they just do it continuously, and but it's not just in terms of indigenous people. I mean, they deploy that tactic per se across the board. And there are those that they consider, some of their citizens they consider to be more virtuous than others. But it just struck me how, I got really wild when I was just so angry when I read this stuff, and it just jumped out to me like dog's balls, that this stuff, the way they deploy virtue to...
Like what?
Dog's balls? That's a technical term?
Chris Anderson was asking that. It's perfectly fine. Use the phrase.
Well, I'm not talking about leaky condoms. Leaky condoms.
That seems like a mixed metaphor.
Sorry, can you put me on track? What was this? Did I answer anything?
Yes.
It was very obvious to you that.
Sorry, I'm now in the leaky condom and the dog balls.
Should we move to the next question?
Yeah.
Is there one more question? We still have the vans to contend with, but does anybody have any last question they want to ask? There's somebody had their hand up over here. Oh, I'm sorry.
Up here.
Yeah, see, I should just let you moderate. Speak.
Oh, sorry, no.
No, I can't. I still can't see. Oh, there we go. She's got her hand up tentatively. You in the blue, white.
Only tentative because one feels very humbled by keynotes like yours, and therefore people humbled to speak and ask anything. I'm really profoundly moved by how you've articulated that something as positive and Christian as virtue can be utilized to oppress, demean, destroy, annihilate populations. And such a contradiction of both religious faith and doctrine and humanity is quite sweeping in its efficacy and also in its power. So that's what I first am thinking about. But then my question is sort of, I think a lot of us are students of probably Foucault. I have 2 personal heroes. One is Helena Sissus, and the other is Vandana Shiva. And what they argue vis-a-vis sovereignty of peoples, especially women, are so connected in this entire symposium's interest and commitment to reminding us that indigeneity is the origin of all peoples, however different they can be, whether it's women or communities or other natives or indigenous, that they center their origins and their rights from the land that we sit on, rather than being divined from that crown, or whoever then deadheads the crown and then wears the sovereign's clothes. So I'm just sort of curious how we can think about unraveling power, therefore, knowing that we have different heroes, and that they're very similar, but that they look and feel a little different.
I guess the difference between my analysis and theirs is that I'm more interested in kind of like structurally and institutionally rather than the subject. although I do write elsewhere about indigenous sovereignty. And I think that, but I still want to argue, if I kind of use people's idea of sovereignty, that it doesn't have a human-centeredness, and those two theorists, like Foucault, still tend to centre the human, right? But that's a problem with the West, because it is human-centred, rather than understanding that we are only part of this planet, like that we basically are not at the top, and the way in which Indigenous people, and I'll just talk about, I suppose, Tom and Milka, and it struck me that, having these kind of critical conversations, that there are different epistemologies operating, and for Pondamuka people, we have an ontological relationship to land, which was not taken, colonisation did nothing to that, right? And so our sense of who we are is very much connected to our ancestors, our creative beings, and where we are. And we have to take care of country and take care of one another, yeah? But we must also pay respect to that land which gives to us, yeah? So in that sense, as a child, you get socialised into thanking the animal that gives up its life for you. It is an understanding about that when I go to track an animal, unlike the West, I'm not there to discover what all about this animal. Rather, the epistemology is about what the animal teaches me about itself and how it gives itself up to me. And that's a different way to think than in the West, yes? So, yeah, my other work, but for me, I wrote about that stuff. But in terms of patriarchal white sovereignty, I think that it is about understanding that, because and this again is using, indigenous epistemology, because the animal reveals itself to me, I learn about it so I can track it and captivate it. Right? Think about that in terms of patriarchal white sovereignty. If I want to capture it, what do I have to know? I have to know. It's like with the animal, I have to know what it tells me about where it eats, what it eats, where it shits, where it sleeps, where it sits in the afternoon, where it is in the morning. Yeah. I have to know all this stuff in order to get it, even though it reveals itself to me. And I see that in terms of looking at this, because this is what actually, I'm not going to swear again, it is the thing that actually totally oppresses us as kings. And it really needs to be deconstructed, shaped, changed, because if we are to change the direction in which we're heading as human beings with the planet, we need a different way to be human. We need a different way to be human. But at the moment, we have to tell everybody about this.
Thank you for your talk, Eileen. That's a great place to end, and thank you all for coming and staying later than expected, and have a great night, and we'll see you bright and early in the morning, and there's some great panels, so I encourage you all to come.
Thank you all very much.